Thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the narcissism epidemic, which is ideas Gene Twenge and I wrote about in a book recently, and have been doing research on ever since, and talk more generally about narcissism in terms of cultural and individual problems. So, okay, that arrow, see if I can get this thing to go forward here. There we go. I'd like to start with just some images of a narcissistic culture, allegedly. So what you can see here is image of Paris Hilton with the Paris Hilton shirt. We always say in narcissism that when Paris was engaged to somebody named Paris, that was the greatest moment in narcissism, in the history of narcissism, at least modern history. We've got reality television. This is Jersey Shore, which is, this and Variants have been one of the most popular television shows in the world. We have the rise of plastic surgery, especially in young people. Over in the corner, we have a hot air balloon, like symbolizing Balloon Boy, who I always think it's the one guy who's going to always be more famous than me because his dad pretended to put him up in a hot air balloon, and Charlie Sheen and others. So there's just a range of these popular images we see in society. But we see it in politicians, too, and things that are a lot more serious than television or celebrity culture. So we have several politicians lately who take their shirts off and photograph themselves. They actually, at least one of them looked pretty good, but it's just sort of this odd internet-based behavior. We have many scandals. John Edwards had this great moment of narcissism where he blamed other people for his own ego. So he said, you know, these people look up to me, and I became narcissistic and egotistical, and then I cheated on my wife who had cancer and had a love child. So it's just an odd case of blaming others for your narcissism. When we have all these scandals on Wall Street, these are the obvious ones. Most of them don't get caught, and we have issues with athletes too. So this is all over the culture, and especially people in power, which is, I think, makes it more troubling. So what's narcissism? Well, I think about it as having three basic components. You have this positive, inflated view of yourself. You think you're special. You think you're very attractive. You feel entitled. You're grandiose. You think you're wonderful and talented, etc. At the same time, you lack emotional intimacy. You act empathy and interpersonal warmth. You can have lots of relationships. You can be very charming and very charismatic, but the real empathy, the real depth isn't there. And then you get this really interesting situation, which is the social psychologist in me likes, where you think you're better than you are. You think you're a legend, at least in your own mind. So you have to set up your life. You have to regulate yourself, so you always feel and look like a legend, like the great person you see yourself. And so what you end up doing is you end up using other people, and you can do this because you don't have a lot of those caring, warm relationships. You need to use other people to keep looking good. So you might brag, you might show off, you might get a trophy partner, you know, trophy spouse. You might be very competitive when it suits you. You might jump at the chance to be on television. You might name drop. Sometimes you talk to people and you let your eyes glaze over to show you have power. You throw the BMW keys on the table when you go to a bar so people know you've got cool stuff. So you do all these things to make yourself look good, and when it's successful, it really does work. You feel very good about yourself, and other people can like you. When it fails, you end up with problems. So when people are narcissistic get negative feedback, when they're told they're not that smart, not that attractive, or they get rejected socially, people say, I don't want you, I don't want to have a relationship with you. Often you see this anger, hostility, aggression. And when you read about a lot of sort of school shootings or other violent crimes, a lot of times you'll see that social rejection piece in there. I got fired, I got dumped. That triggers these things. Because I'm talking to psychologists or psychology students, there's a couple other things I want to mention that are a little more detailed. One is there's a difference between narcissistic personality, which is mostly what I'm talking about, and narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. That's the NPD is the psychiatric or clinical disorder, and the personality is something on which we all fall on the spectrum. What's the difference between those two? Well, NPD is more extreme. It's supposed to be in a much smaller percentage of the population. I'll show you some data on that. And it's also considered disorder when it messes up your life, when it messes you up at work, when it messes up your relationships. So they're related, but they're not the same thing. The second is there's this real difference in the literature you'll see between grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. People who study organizations, who study leadership, who study politics, who study celebrity, you see a lot of grandiose narcissism. People who are outgoing and charming and confident. And these are most of the people I'm going to be talking about today. But there's also this other form of narcissism you see, especially in certain clinical conditions. These are people that think they're terrific, but at the same time have low self-esteem and are depressed and are very fragile and vulnerable. I always imagine somebody living in his mom's basement, screaming at the TV, "Damn you, Alex Trebek, the money should be mine." And that's the more vulnerable form of narcissism. So that's a big kind of issue in the field right now. How do we measure narcissism? Well, typically the most common measure we use is the narcissistic personality disorder. So here are some items just to help you make sense out of it. If I ruled the world, it would be a much better place. I think I'm a special person. I wish someone would someday write my biography. I like to look at myself in the mirror. Now, you might think, the world's pretty messed up. I'd like to rule it. It might even be better. And I wouldn't mind having somebody write my biography. But if you think that, and you think, I want to rule the world, and I look so good doing it, I want somebody to take a picture of it, and I want somebody writing about it, and I'm the only one who can do this because I'm special, that's when you get the real narcissism. Now, you can compare that to self-esteem, and these are items from the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Inventory. I feel that I'm a person of worth, at least on an equal plane with others. I take a positive attitude towards myself. I'm able to do things as well as most other people. I feel I have a number of good qualities. Again, this has to do with a positive feeling about yourself, but it's not the extreme sort of grandiose sense of narcissism. And generally, self-esteem is not a negative thing. Narcissism tends to be more negative. So when we talk about narcissism and changes in society, there's a couple ways to think about it. The first question is, are people today more narcissistic than they were 25, 30, 40 years ago? And we have some data on that. These are data on college students. The reason we have college students is not to pick on them. It's just college students take intra-psych classes and do research, and so we can get the data. But that you find an overall increase in college student narcissism of a couple points. This sample from Davis. This is South Alabama. Again, not to pick on South Alabama. It's just we happen to have data from them that people have published. So what you find is a moderate increase in average narcissism. Scores go up about a third to half a standard deviation. What that means is happening is the average college kid today is a little more narcissistic than 20 years ago. But when you move everybody up, the number of people at the extremes goes up quite a bit. It just it's just a statistical phenomenon. So what you see now are a lot more narcissistic, or very narcissistic people, and you can see these in data from the National Institute of Health, looking at the lifetime prevalence of narcissistic personality disorder. And this is from a sample of about 35,000 people, and they found in people in their 20s, the lifetime prevalence was about 1 in 11, or 11%, so about 1 in 9, a little higher for men, a little less for women. In their 60s, it goes down to about 1 in 30. So we have much higher rates of narcissism in young people. Now, I think that the rate of narcissistic personality disorder is a little high there. I think those numbers are lower. Other clinicians have said that, but the pattern is still very strong, and the symptoms are much higher in young people. What about self-esteem? Well, in the same way narcissism has gone up, self-esteem's gone up. And what you can see here, the color's got changed a little bit, but the color on top is college student self-esteem, which has gotten so high now that we're almost at the top of the scale, which is 40. High school self-esteem is going up. Sometimes we find high school self-esteem has increased. Sometimes it hasn't. Middle school self-esteem has increased in quite a bit since about 1980. So we have self-esteem going up on all accounts. And again, with college students, the average self-esteem is so high the scales are almost useless. We've also had increases in how people rate themselves. So this is a huge study, about 6 million people that were asked in the mid-60s and recently to rate themselves compared to other people their same age on a range of traits. And what we find is a general increase on self-confidence, both intellectual and social, drive to achieve, leadership ability, public speaking ability, writing ability, math ability, artistic ability, academic ability. It's not that people are crazy now. It's not everybody saying I'm number one, but we've got this general shift in more positive self-views. So individuals seem like they're becoming more narcissistic. What about society? Well, what you'd expect in a narcissistic society is greater vanity, greater materialism, greater sense of uniqueness, more antisocial behavior, more problems in relationships, greater entitlement, and changes in religious practice. And I'm going to talk about a few of those here just to give you a taste of it. What's very interesting is trying to find data that shows these over time and trying to find data sets that can measure things like uniqueness. But this is a fabulous data set. This is the Social Security Names Database, which I recommend anybody looking on because it's really interesting to see how names have changed over time. But what we looked at in this study was the uniqueness of names. And in this graph, what we show is what % of kids, boys and girls, have one of the top 10 most popular names on a given year. And those names have changed over time. Names change with fashion in general. So what you found in 1945 was that about 1 in 3 boys, about a third, had one of the top 10 most popular names. Then it was James, Robert, and John. So if you were in a class, there'd be 2 James, very likely. Today, you find more like 1 in 11 boys has one of the top 10 most popular names. So in this case, Jacob, Michael, or Ethan. So uniqueness is valued more. You find the same pattern with women. In the 40s, there's about a quarter of women have one of the most popular names, like Mary, Linda, or Barbara. Today, it's about 1 in 12, 8%. So names like Emily, Isabella, and Emma. When you look at celebrity names, and you wonder what's driving this, you have celebrities now who name their kids, you know, Inspector Pilot or Pilot Inspector, and the latest one, Blue Ivy, Apple. Celebrities name their kids names that aren't names because that way they can ensure uniqueness. And again, this isn't bad. It's just a cultural change where we value uniqueness. And unique names set us apart, whereas sharing names with people connects us as a family, as a society, as a culture. What about social bonds? Well, the one thing that's important to point out, I think, and it's really interesting and counters a lot of this, is that the aggression and violence rates have gone down in the United States since the early 1990s. And they've gone down around the world, but especially in the U.S. So we are not becoming a more violent culture. So I just want to say that up front because that's really good news. What you do see, though, are these very strange cases of very public or YouTube-based violence. And here are some examples. Well, this is Cho from Virginia Tech. The one up above are 2 girls from Florida who invited a friend over and beat her up and then put it on YouTube. In Cho's case, he made the videos before the crime. And so what we see now are people doing violent acts who are filming themselves beforehand to basically set up press releases or something like press releases. They put it on YouTube. YouTube usually will take these down, but then the media will put them on the air, and then they'll go back on YouTube via the media. So it's a change in sort of this very public form of violence. There's also been a general drop in trust societally. These are data from the General Social Survey, but you can just see that since the 1970s, which was still a cultural malaise, we've just seen a general drop in trust in societies. We get more atomized, more individualized. We trust people a little less. And empathy is dropping. So this is a study Sarah Conrad did looking at about 13,000, these are again college students, from the 70s to today, and you find this drop in empathy. Again, it's not huge. It's not that everybody's a psychopath, but the direction is towards less connection and less empathy. And finally, there's been this change in concern for others, with one notable exception. So these are just an example from a large study we just published, but this compares the baby boom generation to Gen X to millennials. And generally what you find is a decrease in desire for a job with altruistic attitudes, a decrease in desirability of working in social services and organizations, an increase in volunteering. And this is the one big countercultural trend we see in behavior, where people today, young people today, volunteer more than they did in my generation and even back to the baby boom. But we find a decrease in charity donations, a decrease in willingness to eat differently if it means more for starving people, basically a flat change in empathy for outgroups. This is interesting because prejudice has dropped against most groups. We have a more individualistic society, and we don't judge people as much based on the groups. The prejudices, though, that have gone up are things like prejudice against overweight people, because we see being overweight as a choice, and so it's okay to be prejudiced about that. But generally, the trend towards prejudice is going in I think, what's the right direction. And you can even see these changes in song lyrics. So this is a large study we did, and by we I mean Rick Pond, who's a grad student at Kentucky, but basically analyzing the lyrics of top 10 popular songs since the 80s to today, and just running them through a word analysis. And what we find are more I, me, mine, fewer we and us, more social or more antisocial words and fewer social words. So just a general trend towards more individualism and social and antisocial behavior in song lyrics. And no, it's not just hip hop. I mean, this is across areas. Religion's changing as well, and I always find this absolutely fascinating, because religion has always been one of those places where, you know, you're supposed to give up a little bit of yourself, and the trade-off is you have a more meaningful and fulfilling life. But we find American religion has become much more individualistic. So these are Pew data, and we find that about a quarter of people have changed faiths. And if you look at people moving from one Protestant sect to another, so Methodist to Lutheran, we find almost half, 44% of adults have changed the religion they're in. And they do this because they just feel something's a better fit. I mean, my parents, I was raised Episcopalian, and my parents called one day and said, hey, guess what, we're Catholic now. We like the church better. And that's just what people are doing. If you look at the beliefs they have in the religions too, people pick and choose. They have these what we call cafeteria beliefs. So this is an example of people. There's a graph on the left side, which are people who are self-identified Protestant who believe in astrology and attend Catholic Mass. So you get these people who have these very diverse beliefs. If you look at the belief in mysticism, you get about a quarter that say they've been in touch with the dead, about 20% have had ghostly experiences, 15% have had psychics, a quarter of people believe in spiritual energy in trees and astrology and reincarnation. Yoga is a spiritual practice. 16% believe in the evil eye and curse casting. So we have a very diverse religious view that people have. And what's really, I think, what's fascinating is that people have had these direct experiences with God to a much greater extent now than they did in the 60s. So the number of people who have had mystical experiences has gone from 20% in 1962 to 50% today. And again, I think a large part of that is people just want to have a direct connection with God. They don't want to go through a priest. They don't want to go through a church. They just want it themselves. It's much more individualistic. So what religions are growing? Well, ones that focus on individual needs, often prosperity theology or growth of success. This is reportedly the biggest church in America, which is Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church, which has almost 40,000 people. And it's a prosperity theology. It teaches caring and concern, but also how to get wealthy, and that's, again, what people want now in church. So what's causing all these changes? the way we look at it is anything in society that allows us to be grander than we are, to present a inflated image of ourselves, are going to be grounds for narcissism. So changes in parenting and education and social networking and culture, celebrity culture and credit. I'll just talk briefly about those. What we had in education starting in about 1980 was the self-esteem movement. And so we decided to give kids high self-esteem. So the way we did that was not to say, hey, have friends, work hard, feel good about yourself, which is a good way to get self-esteem. We decided to make them feel special. So my kids, for example, have sung this, I am special. I'm not going to sing this, but the I am special song. This is an all about me project where you talk about what makes you unique. My daughter had one where she has to list her special talents, and I never know the answer to that because I always think special talents are juggling plates. But these kids are supposed to have them. The one on the right is a drawing my daughter got in an anti-violence book, which you color that in and it says, you are special. What we know, by the way, if you want to reduce violence, is you don't make people feel special. You make people feel the same as everybody else. You make them feel connected. That's why for thousands of years when we put groups together, we dress them the same way. We give them the same haircuts. We give them similar symbols. That brings people together. Telling people they're special and individual and unique makes them stand apart and makes it easy to threaten people. This is a self-esteem book. We've also had this trend of trophies where we've had a massive increase in the number of awards people have gotten. Again, I think the intentions are right. I think teachers are wonderful and they're trying to make kids engage with school, but I think it's gone a little overboard. We've had major increases in grades in high school and especially colleges, so massive grade increases. Again, part of this is to protect self-esteem in kids. And then people said, well, maybe everybody's getting smarter. Well, there's not a lot of evidence for improving ability. These are data from the National Education Department of Education, and you find, at least for the teenagers, for the 17-year-olds, that you found no increase in mathematics, 2 points out of 500, from 1973 to today. You find some increases in younger kids, but that goes away with older kids. You find 1 point out of 500 increase in reading, so there's no real change. And then people say, well, maybe everybody's studying so much and they're so busy, but they've done work on study hours. This is a paper by Babcock and Marks where they looked at how much people study in the 60s to today. And this is by major, which is interesting because if you look at psychology, or at least the social sciences, we are not the hardest studying group. The engineers are still, but we've dropped, almost in half the amount that undergraduates study from the 60s. What has changed, though, is expectations. So what we find is that the number of people expecting to have a profession, expecting to go to graduate school, has gone up dramatically since the 70s, whereas reality hasn't changed at all. So we've created a society where expectations are up and reality hasn't changed, which is ideally you want to change reality and not expectations. And of course, when you do that, you get entitlement. So this is a study done recently at UC Irvine, but it's items like trying hard is a valid reason for a professor to increase a grade. You get about, 2/3 of students agree with that. If I've attended most classes for a course, I deserve at least a B. You get about 1/3 saying that. Professors who won't let me schedule the final around my vacation are too strict. You get about 30%. Not everybody is saying this, but it's a significant minority that show these sort of gross displays of entitlement. Now, well, what about media? Well, media has changed in very interesting ways, again, to become more narcissistic and really more democratized. And what's happened with media is that every one of us has the potential to be a star if we're willing to do something outrageous, silly, or stupid enough to get noticed. So we see this in all sorts of reality television. We see these cases like Balloon Boy. We see the classic cases of people accidentally having sex tapes stolen, which was a while it took it to fame. So all these pathways people use to get famous, it's not via being famous, it's not via success that leads to fame, it's just becoming famous for the sake of fame. So this is a great study that Mark Young and Drew Pinsky, the host of Love Lines, did, looking at narcissism in celebrities. And he managed to give out the narcissistic inventory to a couple hundred celebrities, which is amazing because celebrities don't take personality tests for obvious reasons. They got to control their image. And what you find is really interesting. You find that overall celebrities are more narcissistic than the general population, but the highest narcissism in celebrities is reality TV stars. I mean, their narcissism scores 19.5 almost on average versus population, which is about 15. So they are significantly higher. And the other thing that's interesting is the lowest group in celebrities are musicians. And I was talking to a professor about this recently and said, well, the thing with music is you can't really do it alone. You need to work with other people to make the best music. Whereas reality television, you can sort of be your own person, obnoxious, and that works. So I thought that, I don't know if that's the case, but so there's very much a change in culture. And what that's done is it's made fame a more important value. So this is a Pew data of young people, which looked at generational goals, and famous was number 2 goal. Little more than spiritual and being a community leader. You see this now in kids shows. These are the shows my daughter watches. Yes, I admit it. I let my kid watch stuff on TV. And what you see in a large number of these shows for young kids are things like that involve fame. So this is the theme song for Hannah Montana. You get the limo out front, all the shoes. Yeah, when you're famous, it can be kind of fun. Here's another one. Look around. Everyone's shining. It's brighter somehow. We're going to make a brand new sound like we own this town. Welcome to the big time. Welcome to the good times. I think that's Big Time Rush. I shouldn't admit this, but what the heck. You don't have to be afraid to put your dreams in action. You'll never fade. You'll be the main attraction. Because when you live in your imagination, tomorrow you'll be everyone's passion. That's the theme song for Victoria. So a lot of these shows have a theme of kids become famous. They often don't have parents, or they have sort of these distant parent figures, and that's the plot. And so when my daughter's generation goes up, the desire for fame should be quite a bit higher than it is now. Finally, we have emerging media, which is a huge source of conversation in narcissism. And what's interesting is that these things are very recent. I mean, Facebook, you're talking 7 years it's been around. So these things are interesting, but we do find narcissism makes a difference. So these are studies I've done with my students looking at Facebook and MySpace and looking at what narcissism predicts. And you find people on social networking, or narcissistic people have more interactions, just more quantity of interactions. They're more self-promoting when they discuss themselves, need like about me sections. And then you find just this general change in photos, so sexier photos, more self-promoting albums, more fun albums, maybe more provocative albums. And there's some differences between MySpace and Facebook. But the general pattern is people who are narcissistic use the web to show off, and they have lots and lots of connections, which means that when we go on Facebook, if we have lots of connections, those connections are going to be overrepresented by people who are narcissistic. And what we're going to see them doing is showing sexy and provocative photos and fun albums and talking about themselves in a very positive way. And so that shapes culture. And again, Facebook can be used for lots of very positive things. It can be used for self-promotion, but also to maintain close relationships. It's not a bad media. It's just a very fertile media for narcissism. And the final thing I want to talk about is credit, which is credit is a great tool for realizing narcissism, which we've seen culturally. So with credit, I can be anything I want to be. It's like my fairy godmother. I can go buy a BMW tomorrow. If I have this conversation with you, I go, God, all these people have to listen to me. This is awesome. I deserve a BMW. I could go buy one tomorrow. I don't have the money, but they'll just give me one. I just have to write a check every month. What we saw was a giant increase in housing. We also see far more credit on campus than 20 years ago. I mean, they literally will sell credit cards on campuses to students or give them away. And we have huge student loan debts. We have this massive amount of credit. Credit's great, but like the fairy godmother, you know, you make the coach out of a pumpkin, but at midnight it turns into a pumpkin again. And that's what's happened culturally. So this is a graph showing our household debt, which has gone up dramatically since the 70s. And we've mistaken a lot of this for how successful we are. It's just really how much we spend. And we've even seen this in our public. So the national debt, just to cheer everybody up in the audience, is about $50,000 a person that we all owe nationally. So I figure my family's $200,000 in debt. And that's just an example of, well, we got to buy stuff and we've got to look good even though we don't have the money. So we see these cultural changes in narcissism. We see people becoming more narcissistic. What's going to happen from here? What seems to be going on is that everything is pointing in the direction of greater narcissism. There's more, the media hasn't changed to become less narcissistic. It's becoming more so. There's more online. There's more opportunities for living in some sort of fantasy life online. There really hasn't been anything that's changed except the economic changes, where with credit collapsing and the economy dropping down, we've seen people sort of reining in materialism a little bit. So we've seen a little less plastic surgery with the credit crisis. We've seen less McMansions. We've seen people with smaller cars. So there have been some changes that way, but there hasn't been any in education or the media or celebrity culture or anything else. So we're really at this interesting point where if the economy gets worse, you know, we keep thinking, well, maybe it'll change like the Great Depression and people will start getting back to work and finding meaning in their families and we'll go back to where we were. Or we just keep going the way we're going until we hit some sort of point where everybody's so special that it's just it's paradise. And that's the question I don't have an answer to.
So Keith, our first question is, do you know of any changes coming in the DSM-5 related to narcissistic personality disorder?
That's a can of worms. It's actually been fascinating. What happened was in the current DSM-4, we have 10 personality disorders, or 10 specific ones. And what we know is that personality disorders are part of normal personality. They really seem to work that way. They don't seem to be as discrete as we describe them. And we also know they overlap a lot. So they decided to change the DSM in the DSM-5 to have less overlap in personality disorders. So they decided to cut them in half to 5 personality disorders. And in the process, they got rid of narcissism. And I don't know if you've seen this. People were talking about this a lot about a year ago, and it became a big debate in the field. They've then brought narcissism back into the DSM-5, and so we will have narcissism in 2013. What's still being worked out is exactly what it's going to look like, and I think just to give you the inside baseball issues, the debate as I see it is how do you have this grandiose, outgoing form of narcissism and also have this very vulnerable narcissism without making it really confusing. And as it's presented now, it's really confusing. And I'm arguing, and my colleagues are arguing, to simplify this and sort of make vulnerable narcissism somehow separate from the overall diagnosis. But I don't know if we'll win this one. And it's just still being discussed.
Great. All right, next question is, do you see the Occupy Wall Street movement as a symptom of this narcissistic epidemic?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because culturally you see so much wealth with so few people, and you can, without getting into politics or economics, but too much, you see what's happened is the wealth in the country spread dramatically since 1980, meaning that the rich are richer and the poor are pretty much the same. I don't know if they get much poorer. And we talk about this as a Gini index, and that goes up every year, and it goes up. It correlates so strongly with narcissism, it's very hard to know which came first. And Occupy Wall Street, in some senses, it could be seen as a backlash against that dispersion of wealth. On the other hand, you can say, geez, go get a job. Don't just, and, is it just a bunch of entitled people who want free stuff? And so you can really make a case for narcissism on either side, either as a backlash against narcissism or as really an example of sort of too much entitlement. And I haven't been up there to New York and talked to people, and I don't really have a real strong opinion on either side.
All right, great. So next question is, how does this align with the idea of UPR? And I'm not familiar with that. I don't know if you are, Keith.
I don't know what UPR is.
Okay, so whoever asked that, if you could clarify, and we'll go on to the next question, and we'll come back to that. So next question is, are we seeing these trends outside of the U.S. as well?
There is a lot of discussion around the globe about increasing narcissism. I think the most well-known example is in China, where they talk about little emperor syndrome, where you have kids that get so many resources thrown at them because of the one-child policy, and also because of increasing wealth, that we're seeing greater narcissism. And so that I think is the most outstanding example. But this is something people talk about in Asia. It's something that's a concern in the Middle East. I've heard people talk about this in Europe as well, and even Brazil. I haven't had a lot out of Africa, a little bit, but it does seem to be something very global. I think in India, the real concern is with the celebrity culture. I've talked to people over there, and the massive celebritization of their culture. So yeah, I think this is really a global phenomenon. I think U.S. is leading the charge, as we often do with things, but this is not isolated to the United States.
Okay, great. So next question. Do movies with violence between children, for example, the recent Hunger Games movie, does that increase narcissism?
I don't know. I didn't see Hunger Games. I was going to take my daughter to see it, though, which is probably awful. Our movies, like I think Harry Potter, it's actually done in a much more traditional, non-narcissistic road, where you have a reluctant hero who doesn't really want fame. The movies are about friendship. There is a lot of violence, but it's very much based on sort of equality and friendship. I think Lord of the Rings, well, I guess they're hobbits. They're not children, but they're still. But again, that very communal basis of the movie. I don't know about Hunger Games. I just haven't seen it. But I think it really depends on I think the fame focus is really the concern for a lot of the movies with kids versus, I mean, when you see the aggressive or more these adolescent, hyper-masculine social roles that I think promote some narcissism.
Okay, great. So back to that question, was how does this idea align with, and the term was Rogerian unconditional positive regard.
Oh, cool. No, I think it's really interesting, and I don't know the history well enough with Maslow and Rogers, but I think what's happened in a way is that you see it in Maslow's work and Rogers, but especially Maslow's, this idea of self-actualization, of becoming sort of the best person you can possibly be. And that was something that was very desired in the 60s. We had people finding themselves, trying to be the best they could be. And that was very challenging. And then what you see happen about 1970, 1969, 1970 is really where it starts, is people seem to move down the hierarchy of needs into self-esteem and focusing more on not becoming actualized but feeling good about themselves. So I think that's the general trend with Maslow. In terms of unconditional positive regard, I think experiencing compassion, experiencing somebody looking at you in a compassionate way will reduce narcissism. That's what we find in our research, is the feeling of compassion is a buffer against narcissism. And I think there's a difference between I value you as a person, I respect you, I feel compassion for you, and empathize with you, I think would be positive. I think saying you're special and you're better than other people is where you get narcissism, and in some ways it's a fine line.
Okay, great. So
I hope I didn't get too far off the reservation on that one, Nicole.
No. Great question.
Yeah, very good.
So next question is, do children who are not as narcissistic fall behind socially because they can't keep up with their more narcissistic classmates?
That is a very interesting question, and what you find with a lot of these things, I mean, this is speaking as a parent, and believe me, I'm not necessarily a good one, but what you'll find is, hey, all the kids are like, all my friends have cell phones. I want my iPhone too. And what do? You say, look, you've got to earn your iPhone, and you're 13, and you need to save up for it, or maybe when you're 16. But then you say, gee, if I do that, then my child will be socially ostracized and won't have friends. And so do I give her the iPhone just so she has friends? And I think that's just a real challenge, where in some sense materialism seems to be able to help people fit in. My general perspective on that is to side with not being narcissistic and trying to be a decent human being, and realize you might take a short-term social hit in adolescence because of that. You might not be the coolest kid in school, but people might respect you, and they'll respect you as you get older. But it's a trade-off for sure, and it's a challenging one.
Right. And then we have time for one more question. So do you think reforms need to be made to our education system, or is the solution more to back off in terms of regulation?
I think that the idea of the focus on self-esteem in education could be dropped completely. I mean, I just don't see it makes any sense at this point. And clearly our self-esteem in college students, at least, is so high that we've succeeded at whatever goal we had. So I would simply eliminate it. The challenge we're getting, though, I think beyond that is we have a strand in education, which is we want more testing, we want more extrinsic focus. You do things for the test. And so what we're seeing is people being less creative and less intrinsically focused, so less sort of doing things for their own joy or for their own personal growth and doing things more for getting a grade. And I think that itself is problematic, that we have to figure out a way to keep that creativity and keep that intrinsic motivation so that we don't fall behind culturally. I think these are important skills, and that's where there's some real debates going on. And again, I think, anyway, these are great questions, very good questions.
Yeah, they are, and actually that kind of brings us to the end of our second session. So thank you, everyone, for your really great, thoughtful questions, and thank you, Keith.